що наступна доповідь для всіх, так як і для нас, для всіх членів оргкомітету, була дуже довгоочікуваною. Ми з нетерпінням чекали приїзду нашого спікера, якого, напевно, немає потреби особливо докладно представляти, так, професора з Риму, з університету з Риму, пана Алесандра Портелі, на напрацювання якого ми всі з вами багато років посилаємося, вивчаємо, продовжуємо подумки, можливо, кожен в межах своєї сфери дослідницької дискутувати, аналізувати, ставити самі собі запитання. Отже, я не буду довше затримувати і надам слово, власне, пану Алесандро. Будь ласка.
Thank you. I'm truly excited to be in this lovely town, in this wonderful company, in this beautiful university at this very complicated time. And I come here expecting that this would be a learning experience for me, that I would be learning from colleagues and speakers, and it's already happening. I've already learned quite a good deal in the first part of our conference. So let me thank the organizers, the university, the Ukrainian Oral History Association, and the translators, which make it possible for me to participate in this event. Now, one of the reasons why I feel a little bit out of place is that, of course, I do not come from a country at war, at least not technically, at least not yet, because Italy is very heavily involved in two very different wars, in Ukraine and in Gaza. On the other hand, we do have a history of war of independence, a history of being invaded and occupied. And so what I thought I would do is I would preface with a few general thoughts on the uses, on the structure, on the shapes of memory, and then see if I can apply it to the history of my own country. And I would start with something that we've often been faced with. That is that whenever we talk about memory, somebody comes up and says, memory is bad, memory is harmful because it overwhelms us with the weight of the past, and by making us remember the past, it condemns us to repeat the past. And it's a cliche found over and over again. I remember a conference in which students and followers of Michel Foucault insisted that true revolutionaries have no memory, and therefore they can experiment with something new. And of course, they seem to ignore the fact that if you don't know what happened in the past, you might repeat it thinking you're inventing something else. But however, this is a wrong sort of discussion for a number of reasons. Number one, memory is neither good nor bad. Memory is. It's just part of inherent to the fact that we're alive. And memory is like one of those involuntary muscles that act and react independent of our conscious will. In a way, memory is like breathing. I mean, we can improve the way we breathe. We can try to breathe clean air, but we do not have a choice of whether we breathe or not. And the same applies to memory. We can work on memory, exercise memory. We can try to clear the air of false memories, but definitely we cannot, not only we cannot decide whether we remember or not. We cannot even really decide what we remember. And in fact, literature is filled with images of this involuntary memory, from Proust's famous Madeleine to Don DeLillo, Underworld, to Toni Morrison, Beloved. And there's an incredible scene in Beloved where she the Setha, an ex-slave who has escaped slavery, has escaped the plantation, is just walking through a field, and suddenly the smells, the odors of the field evoke the image of the plantation, and the way she remembers it is as a beautiful place. As a beautiful place. And she wonders, perhaps hell is a beautiful place too. It's a pretty place too. So when we talk about, whether we remember, whether we forget, Italy, Italian culture, Italian media are literally obsessed with anniversaries, centennials, and therefore somehow seem to be burdened with a ritual overload of memory. However, in 2012, there was an anniversary that went entirely unnoticed and unspoken. It was a centennial of Italy's invasion and bombardment of Libya, the centennial of Italy's deportation of thousands of Libyans into concentration camps in the desert that soon turned into death camps, of Italy, deportation of the leaders of the resistance, of the Libyan resistance to Italian Isles of Exile. And because we choose not to remember it, we repeated it. That is, in 2012, Italy against joining NATO, bombed Libya, exactly like 100 years before. Again, we deported Libyans and refugees in concentration, in exile and concentration camp and detention camps. And we are now financing death camps in Libya, precisely because we choose not to forget, we choose not to remember history. Well, we just went ahead and repeated it. On the other hand, the other reason why the question of remembering and forgetting is moot is that oblivion is not the opposite of memory. Oblivion, as Yuri Lotman and Boris Uspensky showed many years ago, oblivion is one of the mechanisms of memory. That is, I was once in Santiago de Chile, a site of massacres, and in one of the sites of memory in Santiago de Chile, Villa Grimaldi, which was a death camp during the fascist regime in Chile, there was a quote from Mario Benedetti, a great Latin American poet. And it says, El olvido está relleno de memoria. Oblivion is filled with memory. And another great Latin American poet, Jorge Luis Borges, he explains, oblivion is one of the forms of memory. It's memory's underground, hidden cellar. It's the other side of the coin. Which is why, as Borges' metaphor of the map of the emperor's map makers, if you remember everything, you don't remember anything, because memory is not a deposit of, a place where information is stored and stays there, but rather memory. It's not like the memory of the computer. Memory is the computer, which receives the data and sifts them, selects them, discards those that are not useful, or attempt or suppresses those data, those memories that are still too meaningful. Memory is as an everyday, ongoing labor of tracing the meaning of the past in the present, of our relationship with the past. And as we keep changing in the present, so that relationship is movable and changeable. So, and this is why often the hidden memories. Another definition that Luis Borges gives of memory is a great simulacrum filled with ghosts. And the memories that we suppress, the memories that we would rather not remember, finally comes back as ghosts and haunt us, like the memory of the Italian war crimes in the former Yugoslavia, or in Libya, or in Ethiopia. Forgotten, and therefore haunting us. So the present, the contradiction between the beauty of the landscape and the violence that inhabits it in Toni Morrison's image of involuntary memory suggests the relationship between two possible functions of memory. On the one hand, we have memory as tranquilizer. On the other hand, we have memory as disturbance. And the idea of memory as onus, as weight, as a mere deposit, something immutable, is somehow tied to what we could call memory as monument, monument memory. That is, memory that state institutions, public institutions, and media often somehow impose as a commemoration and celebration of past or present glories, a narrative of national identity that remembers what we're proud of and erases the shadows, the contradictions. But this also applies to individual memories. We like to remember how good we were, how much we suffered, but we hardly ever remembered. We like to represent ourselves as heroes or victims, never as perpetrators or accomplices. So, this idea of memory as monument is often frozen in marble, in bronze, in statues and monuments in our public space, and recently many of these images have come under attack in the West from anti-racist, anti-colonial movements like Black Lives Matter, or in Italy by anti-fascists. In the East, of course, as the symbols of totalitarian regimes that people wanted to get rid of. In a number of occasions in the West, these attacks on the monuments of memory were criticized and as attempts to erase history. In fact, they were history. The movements that changed the representation of our past in our public space, those are history. Those statues were torn down because not because people wanted to erase memory, but because they remembered very well who those slave merchants, who those tyrants, who those slave owners were. We remember. We don't need a monument to Mussolini to remember who Mussolini was. However, we have plenty still in Rome. If you've been incidentally, if you've been watching the European track and field championships on television, you probably noticed that the ground on which the marathon was run, the floor carried repeated over and over and over again, Duce, Mussolini, you're with us. We still have those. So, those images, those icons were, those bronze and marble monuments were the frozen memory of power, and their removal was the action of liberation. Until, of course, the movements of liberation become power and institutions themselves and start creating their own memory as monument. So what we learn from this is that memory is much more alive, much more precious when it does not serve to reassure us how good we've been, how heroic, how suffering, but to disturb us, which I think is irresponsible, the ethical responsibility of all intellectuals and oral historians primarily, to speak the truth to power, speak the truth to power, and to change the dominant, the accepted narrative, to challenge those established certainties that make us feel so good about ourselves. Let me take another example of memory as disturbance from Italian history. In 2011, we had another anniversary that was indeed very much celebrated. 150th anniversary of the proclamation of Italy as an independent state in 1861. And as you know, flags were waved and everybody felt patriotic, myself included, it occurred to me that the whole narrative of those events was based on a metaphor. We have 3 R words that denote the defining moments in Italian history. Rinascimento, Renaissance, 14th, 15th century. Risorgimento, the War of Independence. Resistenza, the fascist, the struggle against Nazi occupation and fascism and the fascist regime. Now, Risorgimento, which is the term we use for our national War of Independence, well, means a rebirth, a re-rising, a resurgence, something that comes back to life. And it occurred to me that Toni Morrison, which you probably realize by now is my favorite inspiration and author. Toni Morrison says at one point, anything dead coming back to life hurts. So the question is, if this nation was coming back to life, where did it hurt? Where did it hurt? And let me tell you a small story from oral history. Because of course, we had monuments to the heroes of, every town in Italy has a monument to Giuseppe Garibaldi, our national hero, or Giuseppe Mazzini, and so on. But where were the memories that hurt? The memories that said, the story is a little bit more complicated. Huh? Probably not in the public space, probably not in the public narrative, not in the school books, but in the memories of families, in private, personal narratives, in oral histories, ultimately. So, and it's in these memories that the birth of the nation appears as something much more problematic than we usually like to talk about. So years ago, incidentally, I had decided to start a project on the history of the labor movement in the steel town of Terni from 1949 to 1953. I did my first interview with a steel worker. At the end of the interview, his wife grabbed the microphone and she had something to say to him. And this is the first lecture thing we learned. In oral history, you have to be flexible. You don't stick to your project. And that's what she says. My father's father, he joined Giuseppe Garibaldi. And he went along with Giuseppe Garibaldi. He joined Garibaldi on the day he married my grandmother. My grandmother was 14, he was 18. After the wedding, he says, let's go home. And then when they got home, he says, okay, I'll go out to buy some meat for dinner. Wait for me here. He went out on the way to the store. Garibaldi and his troop was passing by, going south to liberate Italy. Instead of going back home, he joined Garibaldi, went down south, fought for the liberation of Italy, and came back 4 years later. Incidentally, he had locked his wife in, but somebody opened the door. So, in other words, the memory of the founding of the nation, the encounter with the national hero, the encounter with the patriotic ancestor, the memory of the patriotic ancestor, the fought with Garibaldi, who is the family pride, turns out to be also a memory of abandonment and rupture. Not only did he abandon his bride on their wedding day, but he was later rejected by his own family. And then she says afterwards, they disinherited him from the family. And he said, I don't want anything from you. And in fact, he migrated and came to Terni. Incidentally, the story is set in 1961. My project was 1953. The book I finally ended up writing is The History of Terni, 1821. Incidentally, came 2023. So, because of course because memory has no boundaries, memory has no limits. So, this memory of rupture, this memory of transgression. Another lady whose grandfather also fought with Garibaldi. My grandfather was studying for the priesthood, and he ran away from the convent. He went into hiding. He hid in the woods, and Garibaldi passed through the woods. You know, Garibaldi typically passes by, you know, but there's no place in Italy where Garibaldi hasn't slept or something. You know? So Garibaldi Garibaldi passed through the woods, and he went with Garibaldi. And of course, by going with Garibaldi, he destroyed his family fortune and was later, you know, renounced by his family. Another person talks about two brothers who joined Garibaldi secretly from their parents, and you know, all these people, they broke from the church, they broke from the family, and they joined this long-haired bandit that was crossing Italy, you know, generating disorder and things. The priest that gave me my first communion, when I interviewed him years later, he says, well, after all, Garibaldi, these people, they were slightly exalted people without regularity of things, he says, and they were the followers of a lucky bandit. So there's a split in these memories. They become memories of family and patriotic pride, but they still retain the trace of the break, of the transgression. A young woman whose grandfather went to jail, whose great-grandfather went to jail for being in the War of Independence. She says, my family is very proud of my great-grandfather as a hero of independence. They try to not mention too much the fact that he went to jail. I mean, it's one thing to have a hero for a grandfather, and it's another thing to have a former convict. And one of the points is most of the heroes were convicts before they became heroes. So every birth of a nation is or it's the birth of our nation, but it also applies to the United States, for instance, which we studied, is both the creation of a new order and the traumatic rupture and violation of another order. And this is often the case with trauma. The moment of rupture is often bypassed, suppressed in memory. One of the great stories in American literature, Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving, thank you, by Washington Irving, is the story of a man who falls asleep and wakes up who falls asleep in colonial America and wakes up 20 years later in the free United States. He has skipped entirely the trauma and violence of the war. And there's a story like that in Italy as well, where this man, Maestro Felice Pelosini, falls asleep in 1848 in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, wakes up in 1868 in independent Italy, and he has skipped those 20 years of wars and traumas and ruptures. So the birth of, like all births, we all suffer the trauma when we were born, and so do nations. And in fact, one of the things that there's a little children rhyme that every child knows, and it starts with Garibaldi fu ferito. Garibaldi was wounded. By whom? Garibaldi was wounded by the Italian army because he was trying to continue the war of liberation that he had started by marching to liberate Rome. And the Italian army, the king's army, shot him. So, because one of the things that happened and that keep happening is that those heroes of the war of liberation who were the bearers of the break, of the transgression, of the violence, of the rupture, when the new order is established, are sort of pushed aside. And Garibaldi was, Garibaldi fu ferito is also the title of an excellent book by Mario Snenghi, a brilliant historian, who talks about how the heroes of the war of resistance were lately marginalized and pushed aside by the new power that was established after the revolution. So Risorgimento is a metaphor. Resistance is not, because, as you know very well, people who resist literally, however, many of the heroes of the Italian resistance, many of them, the most radical ones, chose to call themselves Garibaldini. They were also branded as bandits by the Nazis and by the fascists. And in fact, there's a great resistance song that says, "We are the bandits of the mountains." And those who today, the political and ideological forces that are in power in Italy today, and keep talking to us about nation, about patriotism, about Italian identity, about Italians first, are the political descendants of those who in the 1940s stood on the side of Auschwitz, of Hitler, and of the German occupation. And now they talk to us about patriotism and everything. So, however, this resistance was also another, it was called the Second Risorgimento. It was another rebirth of the country. And on September 8th, 1943, Italy signed a separate peace with the Allies, which many conservative historians defined as the death of the nation. And of course, the hundreds of volunteers who went to the barricades to try to stop the Germans from occupying Rome, called the new birth of the nation, called the Second Risorgimento. And uh, and and it is no wonder that even even the communist underground fighters, one of them, they called themselves patriotic action groups. One of themselves, Maria Teresa Regard, there were many women in these underground groups, says, I did not go to the barricades on September 8th because my party told me to. I went because I thought it was necessary to defend my country. So this was the beginning of the resistance to the capital R. After 20 years of silence, after the fascist dictatorship, after almost a century of monopoly of the one-party system, Italy returned as a democracy founded on the active participatory relationship of its people. On the other hand, however, well, it was such a rupture on the one hand that I went through school entirely. I got my high school diploma in 1960 without ever hearing a word about the resistance in class. It was totally suppressed. The trauma, it was a trauma. And all I knew about the resistance was from being in a class where I had at least 5 fascist classmates, and the one communist, I only learned that he had been a communist 25 years later because he was silenced. So, and then mid-60s, there was a change in the Italian political system. The socialists and the Christian Democrats formed a coalition, and suddenly the resistance became the official memory. And one of the things that happened was we changed the songs that describe the anger of partisans and the killing of traitors with songs that describe the sacrifice of dying partisans. Because as an official memory, resistance is always represented by the dying partisan, never by the killing partisan, even though it was a war. Even though, George Washington's army killed British soldiers. Partisans killed fascists. You don't. But memory as monument is how heroic we were. We were such heroes that we fought a whole war without killing anyone, or how much we suffered. So the dying partisan, and also because it became an official memory. It was represented in public ceremonies, in textbooks, in school, as a united, spontaneous movement of the whole Italian people. All Italians rose against the Nazi occupation and the fascist regime, as if the fascists hadn't been Italians too. So, so we forgot entirely the fact that there were Italians who fought on the side of Hitler and his occupying army, and who collaborated actively in sending Jews to Auschwitz and Buchenwald. That's not us. That's not us. We were heroic and suffering. And but there's more. There's more because you see, the conflict is never really only between people. Most of the times it's within people. And one of the things that that the memory as monument of the resistance suppressed is exactly the feeling, the personal memory of those heroes. And I'm talking about heroes. I'm seriously talking about heroes. All the people I will mention from this point on are my heroes. Because, well, as opposed to fascism, with its mythology, fascism was obsessed, fascinated by death, and with its mythology of uh, the powerful who has the right to do anything he wants to the weaker people. The resistance in all its many forms, because in Italy it goes from far left to conservatives and everything in between. But all of these people did not have an ideology of death, and they uh, and they had to practice death, to give death, going against their own consciousness. This was a dramatic conflict. Carla Caponi. Carla Caponi was one of the heroines in Rome. And when she talks about the first time she kills somebody, she says killing is something that goes against nature. Every time you kill a part of yourself. And she killed a part of herself every time she participated into an armed action. Her partner, Rosario Bentivegna, remembers that the first time he says, we were shot. I had shot a man. I couldn't speak. I couldn't be with people after this. My favorite story is by Lucia Ottobrini. Lucia Ottobrini, you'll probably notice that a number of these heroes are heroines. Lucia Ottobrini was a deeply religious woman in her own way. And she says, she blew up truckloads of German soldiers. She did. And she doesn't really much want to talk about it. But one day she opened up and she says to me, sometimes I wonder, was that really me? And all the time, I couldn't really talk to him. And I said, you mean Jesus Christ? You mean you thought Jesus wouldn't understand what you were doing? And she says, yes. I started talking to Jesus Christ after the war was over. I mean, we talked about the sacrifice of the partisans, but the greatest sacrifice was really going against the grain of their deepest held beliefs and values to take arms in a war that had been forced upon them without becoming, as Lucia's husband and partner in the resistance, Mario Fiorentini, said, without becoming warriors, which was not easy. And I would end with, if I can find it, with a quote from Mario Filipponi. Mario Filipponi was a steel worker, and he fought in a number of actions in the war of resistance. And he says, as opposed to the people I quoted earlier, they all fought in the urban guerrilla. He was in the mountains. And in the mountains, it's different. And he says, after you've been 6 months, 8 months, a year up in the mountains, by the time you come down at the end, you're a half animal. There are no two ways about it. I was no longer a normal human being. Today, I say, I was an animal. I realized that in those days, I was out of my mind. I mean, you've come down the mountain with all the hate, all the fighting, the guns, and all the time you expect a shot in the back. And you brought yourself up to such a frenzy that that when it was over, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. And I think this ultimately is a lesson. It wasn't easy. It's never easy. And if we ignore the trauma of being abandoned before you're a hero, the trauma of doing something in exceptional circumstances that you have a hard time recognizing in a time of peace. Unless we recognize all these complications, we might cultivate a memory as monuments of how heroic and how suffering we've been, but it would be false. Thank you.
Дуже дякуємо пану Алесандро за те, що поділився досвідом, за те, що поділився глибинними речами, які сьогодні насправді є дуже співзвучними тому, що чуємо ми під час спілкування, в тому числі із українськими військовими, в тому числі під час спілкування з людьми, які дотичні до фронту, з тими ж волонтерами, з людьми, які більше занурені в мілітарну спільноту, які комунікують на рівні тих людей, які сьогодні частково є в позиції чужих щодо цивільного населення. Якщо вони вийшли за межі своєї родини і опинилися на фронті, то утворюється певною мірою ця прірва. І, зокрема, коли я комунікую з військовими, в мене є такий досвід невеликий, але є, я розумію, що люди перебувають на тій відстані від нас, і ми в жодному випадку не можемо ані зрозуміти, ані наблизитися до того досвіду, так, як можливо було би добре в умовах, коли в країні йде війна, і відстань між різними соціальними осередками, різними спільнотами тільки збільшується, на жаль, на сьогодні. Я дозволю собі запропонувати колегам, які тут присутні, поміркувати і все ж таки сформулювати свій запит, в тому числі до пана Алесандро, щодо того, як все ж таки працювати з пам'яттю, або, можливо, у вас є свої міркування, просто такі маленькі тези, які, можливо, наштовхнуть колег на роздуми і на діалог. Хотілося б, що сьогодні був не просто посил, такий монологічний, а щоб була комунікація, було кілька точок дотику щодо того, як працювати, власне, з подібними наративами і з тими сенсами, про які пан Алесандро, власне, і зазначив, коли людина живе в горах, так, і почувається потім твариною, так, чи не є тваринами сьогодні, я собі дозволю, можливо, досить різко, але деякі представники можливо, мирного, цивільного населення, які дозволяють собі певні ті чи інші реакції. Чи ми взагалі формуємо цей наратив? Як цей наратив конструюється в комунікації? Або, власне, ті запити, які у вас виникли під час лекції. Будь ласка, чи такої промови, я б не сказала лекції, а такої обміну досвідом, який нам запропонував пан Алесандро. Будь ласка, колеги, я запрошую до діалогу. Чи є охочі? Я бачу, так. Я бачу колег, так, не зовсім. Так, будь ласка, бачу руку в кінці. Там має бути кнопка. Можливо, ви давайте, якщо там не вмикається, має бути все. Є?
Hello? Okay.
Окей.
Yulia Skobitska, Princeton University. My question, I was recently working on an article and I was thinking a lot about the importance of memory for our sense of self. And I wanted to, I would like to ask what would you think about this? Because I was interviewing people, for example, and we know that the self has this dimension that unfolds with our time, the time of our experience, with the time of our past. But there are also different approaches to what is the role of our past in our perception of the self. And for example, I'm talking to people and there are some current events that suddenly just trigger some very acute conflict between one's sense of self that is rooted, for example, in the past that was 30 years ago. And I know that if we were talking under different circumstances, for example, under a different state policy, my interviewee would probably be presenting themselves in a different way or maybe highlighting something different. And well, we know that, for example, trauma is not, because it is not getting integrated, it is something that people would be carrying on. But something that is not traumatic suddenly gains so much prominence, like the way I perceived myself as a child that no longer just works with current, I don't know, Ukrainian memory politics. How would you comment on that? Because there are some theories of memory that would say, you know, your past should, I don't know, at least just its relevance should be fading.
Well, I'm not sure I heard everything you said.
Okay.
So that's a problem. But basically, I think, you know, that if you're dealing with difficult memories, with suppressed memories, then I like the word you use, trigger, then some element triggers them and brings them back. You know, the scene in Beloved is exemplary. She's not thinking at all about the past of slavery, but the smell of chamomile triggers that memory. Sometimes it can be our questions. Sometimes it can be our questions, like the Lucio Tobrini's comment about her relationship with Christ. This was not an interview. I was interviewing her husband, and she, the perfect lady, came back with a cup of coffee. And as she was offering me coffee, he asked her about something else entirely. And then, you know, she stood up with this cup of coffee on the tray for an hour and a half talking. She had never talked before. So, and it also said, it depends on the circumstances. So memory is always a relationship between different moments in time. So not only does it depend on, you know, the smells in the air or who you're talking to, but also on well, where you stand at a given moment. So what I think is important is not so much to trigger the hidden memories. I do not believe that a good interviewer is the interviewer that forces things out of the interviewee. A good interviewer accompanies the interviewee. And maybe we can accompany them to the boundary of what can be said and what cannot be said. There's another quote that I use often, and it's in a story by Rebecca Harding Davis. Rebecca Harding Davis was a very early
feminist writer, 1861, and she talks about, she wrote about women and about workers. And at one point she says, I can only give you, show you the boundaries of a night. So if we can get to the boundaries of the unspeakable, and by drawing the boundaries, we can identify the space where the unspeakable lies. Sometimes, then I'll shut up. The Rosario Bentivegna, the hero of the Roman resistance. After they attacked the Nazis in the center of Rome and defeated them, the Nazis responded by massacring 335 prisoners a day. And for a long time, conservative, reactionary public opinion has blamed him for carrying out that action and causing the death of all these people. So one day I asked him, well, did you ever go to the site, because the place of the massacre has become a shrine now. Did you ever go to the shrine where they're buried? And he said, yes, one day I went, and I said, what were your thoughts? And he says, this is an intrusive question. I will not reveal, I will not make a spectacle of my inner feelings, which I think is a much more eloquent answer than if he had tried to describe his feelings. Because in order to describe those feelings, you had to be a poet. And he was a doctor. Otherwise, you would just repeat cliches. But saying, no, I can't talk about it. It tells you so much more about what it means than if he had tried to explain. So I think, we navigate the space between the speakable, the unspeakable, the attempts, again, Toni Morrison, unspeakable thoughts unspoken. And sometimes, you have this distinction between, Rosario Bentivegna said, of course, I've always claimed and never repented for what I did. I think it was the right thing to do. On the other hand, I can't talk about its consequences. So it's a split. And I think this is the kind of information we receive from silences.
Дякую. Будь ласка, ще питання. Пані Наталя, будь ласка.
I wanted to thank you for choosing a topic for your keynote address, which is extremely delicate and of huge importance right now for people in Ukraine. As you know very well, the idea of memory, or rather the focus on memory these days, is very actively pursued. The research conversations, discussions. Somewhere in your presentation, you have spoken of different memory, if I'm understanding you correctly, different memory engagements, not so much between the people as within the people. Unfortunately, Ukraine right now is at the moment when it's very much fights the memory project of an invading state, and that complicates the matter profoundly. And I wanted to ask you for an opportunity to think of another metaphor maybe when it comes to memory. You have mentioned memory as a disturbance, memory as monument, and I have taken thorough notes. Thank you for those. Is there any time in history, and not necessarily in relationship to Ukraine, but to any other country which has complex history, where memory will be about dialogue rather than competition?
About?
Dialogue rather than competition.
Well, number one, I intentionally said I was talking about Italy, and I do not, for one thing, both the Risorgimento and the resistance in Italy were civil wars. the war today, between Ukraine and Russia is not a civil war. So that's a basic difference. That's a huge difference between what's happening in Ukraine and us. And so you do not extend from one context to the other easily, glibly. Dialogue. I hate to go into this because when I start talking, it's hard to shut me up. But perhaps, I mentioned one of the two great moments in my experience, which was Lucia's comment about Christ. The other great moment was my first interview with a couple of African-American people in Kentucky who came from the coal mining region and who had been involved in the civil rights movement and in the union. And the husband, as is often the case, the husband talked and said extremely interesting things. Then he turned to his wife and said, "Honey, do you have anything to say?" And she said, "Not really," and spoke for an hour and a half. And the way she spoke was, I have two examples. Maurice Ravel's Bolero or Twist and Shout, where you repeat the same phrase and you raise the pitch. And she had the structure where she started out saying, cliches, blacks and whites united in the struggle, and so on and so forth. And the signal was, she would say, "And I'll tell you," and then she would raise the stakes. And she started telling me why a number of Black people were against integration, which to me was a shock because I owe my political whatever to the Black movement. And then she kept saying, and at one point she says, and I'll, my grandparents were, and she couldn't say the word. She had a hard time, were the slaves, which of course has all the possible information is right there, how hard it is for her. And my parents have told me stories about that they heard from them. And I'll tell you, because no white person has ever done anything to me. But because you're white, I don't trust you. Now, the question is, she's talking general, present company not included. That is me, my wife, a woman student of mine, sharing Kentucky Fried Chicken. Or does she mean, I don't trust you, Alessandro Portelli? And my choice was, why should she trust me? She's Black, I'm white. She's a woman, I'm a man. She's American, I'm Italian. She's Baptist, I'm an agnostic at best. She's working class, I'm middle class. I mean, all the possible barriers. Why should she trust me? And the moment the color of your skin becomes a matter of life and death, could she trust me? Or could I trust myself? It's very easy now to say that I'm against fascism and anti-Semitism. But in 1938, if my classmates suddenly disappeared, would I have done the right thing? Who knows? Can I trust myself? And then she kept talking about how she said, my grandmother always told me, no matter how good they talk, no matter how good they act, there's always going to be a line. Let them stay on their side and you stay on yours. And then she talked to me for an hour and a half. She couldn't trust me. She talked to me for an hour and a half. 2 years later, I went back and she talked to me for 5 hours. What was she doing? I think that she was trusting me enough to spend a few hours of her life explaining to me why she couldn't trust me. She was teaching me. And so it occurred to me that, the line. She was on one side, I was on the other side, and she was talking across the line, which echoes of my classical education. Speaking across is dialogos. Dialogue is exactly speaking across a line, not erasing the line, but recognizing it and putting it on the ground. And then, and I think this is the core of the oral history interview, because what makes the oral history interview possible is the fact that, well, two people agree to the interview, that maybe we have a language in common or something. What makes the interview interesting is what we don't have in common. I mean, even if you interview your own grandfather, what you don't have in common is age and education. You know, that was so. So the oral history interview itself is a utopic moment of dialogue, because in the oral history interview, you do not pretend that you're living, that you're equals. You know very well we're not living in a society of equals, but you try to talk to each other the way you might talk if you were in a society of equals. Like I have a number of interviews with my students, and of course, and they were interviews in which they revealed a lot, because the moment when I was interviewing them, they had occupied the university. They were the power in the university when we talked. So they could tell me things that they would not tell me under normal circumstances. So I think I don't know much about dialogue. Well, maybe the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has come under heavy criticism anyway, which has not accomplished it, but it was an attempt. Other than that, I think the oral history interview is an example of dialogue across differences, because which is why it's a learning situation.
Дякую. Хто ще готовий долучитися? Пані Ліано, будь ласка, Ліляна.
It's so interesting what you're talking about. I mean, especially about this building bridges and talking across the lines. And I just wanted to come back to the documentation. Like, what's your opinion? Do you think that, for example, researcher or the interviewer from one nation in conflict from one side could be like an interviewer to the other side of conflict in this idea of like talking across the lines, or are you just like too utopian and that's impossible?
I don't know any time that it really happened. Yeah, I can't think of any actual instances, because of course both people would have to be somehow different from the official narrative of their own country. You know, they would be willing to listen to the other person, to the other side, and I guess in a time of outright war, it might happen later. I mean, I've always made it a point of interviewing as many fascists as I could, and it was always very interesting. Always making it very clear which side I was on, you know, because in a number of cases, I don't usually talk to fascists. They had never talked to a radical leftist in their life. It was a revelation for both that we could talk without attempting to convince each other. Just try to learn what's on your mind.
Дякую, будь ласка, пані Наталю.
Thank you for such a dense
I
talk.
can
Oh,
barely hear you. My hearing is not so good anyways.
What about that? Can you hear me now? Thank you. It was such a dense talk and such a thought-provoking answers to the questions. I have a comment maybe, but also if you can reflect on that, on the role of metaphors, because you are using quite many of them, and even the rupture, the crossing the line, the boundaries, those are very dense metaphors. And while we are inside the rupture during the full-scale war, the relationship to the words in Ukraine is quite complicated, especially to metaphors, because the words become flesh, and sometimes you simply cannot use some metaphors because they are so real to human experiences. And therefore, maybe a question, or if you can reflect on that, when we can be back to metaphors, and if the science is one of the repertoires for such metaphors, can we use them now? And if yes, what kind of metaphors are appropriate?
Well, for one thing, I don't think it's really possible to talk without using metaphors, you know, and they're always loaded. Right now, of course, we heard people in power describe the population of Gaza as animals. That's a metaphor. And what I think is that a metaphor at best is an effort to understand something. That is, you use them. I mean, who uses metaphors? Children. And if we ever saw Western movies, Native Americans, you know, the talking stick. Why? Because they don't have the precise word yet. So they have to identify a quality in the object that they want to highlight. And when we use a metaphor, that's what we're doing. So metaphors can kill, and metaphors can save. You know, but but they're always an attempt to understand to get a better definition of the object. So we have as a killing metaphor, they're being used all the time and by both sides independently in Gaza. In our tradition, we have a number of metaphors about the Germans, of course. The Germans were, and the metaphors that we use, or at least that we use about the Germans in the anti-Nazi tradition, are metaphors in which we had, but not only the anti-Nazi, in which we describe the enemy as somewhat not entirely human, because they have no conscience. They're either animals or machines. Those are the metaphors that we have for the Germans. And I remember this interview with this lady who blamed the partisans for causing the Germans' reaction and the massacre. And she said, I mean, they're like animals. They're like lions. Okay, you have a lion. The lion, and he's asleep, he's not doing anything, but then you go and bother him. Of course he bites. So the idea is they do not think before they act. They either react or obey orders. You know? So these are terrible metaphors because because for one thing, they make it much harder for us to understand that the Nazi war crimes were not perpetrated by animals or machines, but by human beings like me, belonging to the same Western civilization and culture, of which I'm very proud. But only Western civilization and culture could create the Shoah. And if we talk about them as machines or animals, we forget that they were human beings.
Колеги, в нас ще є 10 хвилин. Будь ласка, ще можна, думаю, 2 питання. Якщо не буде охочих. Так, окей.
Thank you, Alessandro. It was, as always, very inspiring. My question also and it relates to to metaphors, especially to one you used by this one by Borges, like a memory as filled with ghosts. So in oral history, you sometimes unconsciously reveal so many like ghost traumas from someone's past, and as an interviewer, somebody who conducts those is part of this talk, you kind of keep them, right? Do you have, I'm following your rich experience, any way to like live with them, but not to be like overruled or overtaken by those stories, especially traumatic stories for you? So it's more a question of of something which is now called self resilience. As an oral historian who kind of had so many uneasy stories, but still you have to on one hand you take them seriously and you live with them, but you kind of have to balance them. Do you have any advice we can follow?
No, advice, certainly not. I usually give the wrong advice. So, but the only way you to deal with those ghosts is to face them. We have a number of ghosts in our democratic, radical, progressive tradition that we ignored. I skipped a quote from a classic textbook that says, right after the war, in order to reconcile Italy as a united country, it was necessary to suppress a number of memories. But no true national unity can be built on suppression and denial. It's time we stopped it. So one example of how these ghosts come back as ghosts is because of course the partisans were on the right side, but they did a number of things. They occasionally did crimes as well, and especially what happened on the Italian eastern border, where the Yugoslav partisans massacred at least 3,000 or 4,000 Italians. And this was completely erased from memory because Yugoslavia was because Yugoslavia had broken with the Soviet Union. On the other hand, because Yugoslavs were comrades of our communist partisans, so you don't talk about it. Incidentally, the left-wing historians in Trieste and the borders kept talking about it, but it was the politicians, it was the media, it was public discourse that ignored this. So what happens? After a while, these memories come back as ghosts, as a weapon in the far-right argument against democracy, against socialism and everything. And because we have attempted to suppress that memory, we have no narrative. And so the whole official narrative of Italy about this has bought into the far-right false narrative. Hezbollah, the far right lies about what happened on the eastern border had become the official memory, even of democratic figures like President Mattarella. And so the only way in which they cannot threaten us is to deal with them. If we had a narrative, if we had admitted that the partisans also killed, we would not be faced with now the idea, the resistance was violence, we reject that. Of course it was. I mean, and there were good reasons. There were, it was a Cold War. So one of the ways in which like 30% of the Italian people who voted for the Communist Party could feel that they were being accepted as part of the Italian democracy, of which they were. Actually, they were the main pillar of the Italian democracy. The only way in which was by claiming their role in the resistance. But the only way they could claim their role in the resistance was if we had a sanitized version of the resistance. So this, and then of course, the partisan crimes, the Yugoslav crimes came back to haunt us, and we didn't have a story. We didn't know, or we didn't have a narrative about it.
Будь ласка, пані Наталя.
Thank you so much, Marcin, for the question, and of course to Professor Portelli for answering that. I wanted to come back into the same topic, but again from slightly maybe a different angle. Obviously, oral historians bear a lot these days in Ukraine, and this craft of ours is bearing on the country and the nation. It contains certain, political weight as well. We hope it will contribute to the society's resolving all the matters while the war is on, and especially after the war. I wanted to ask you about Italy and oral history in Italy. How much of a contribution you think oral historians in Italy have made into processes of memory as a dialogue or reconciliatory processes? What is the role of Italian oral history in all that context you're describing? Thank you.
Italian oral history has always existed outside the academy. I'm the only academic that does oral history in Italy, and I was not in history. I was teaching American literature. So the only academic was Luisa Passerini, a great historian whose career was stifled by the fact that she was doing oral history and that she was a woman. But other than that, the founders of oral history in Italy were always on the margin or on the side. Gianni Bosio, Danilo Montaldi, Cesare Bermani, all these people were always outside the public discourse. So the role of oral history has always been challenging official, even challenging the official discourse on the resistance. Cesare Bermani has done in the 70s incredible work talking about the resistance in northern Piedmont. No holds barred, knowing which side he was on, but not ignoring anything. He was entirely silenced. He was entirely silenced by the left, not just by the right. So the effort has always been the deconstruction of the official narrative somehow, or in a way, actually, at times taking the official narrative seriously, which means taking anti-fascism seriously and not ceremonially, which was also the dialogue was never easy. Of course, on the one hand, in the anti-fascist camp, the assumption that all the forces that were part of the resistance belonged to the same constitutional sphere, with the exclusion of the fascists. But when there was an attempt by someone on the left to create a dialogue with the fascists, because you see, truth and reconciliation, our attempt was reconciliation without truth. And which in turn, the attempt to have a dialogue with the far right became, well, the first moment in which they were legitimized. So now we have them in power. Because there was no dialogue. There was no dialogue. It was just a recognition that, incidentally, that the partisans were ideological, especially the communist, socialist radicals, ideological. The young, so-called young people who fought on the other side had values, patriotism, honor. So, I mean, it was really a way of handing them. So there is one famous moment in which Vittorio Foa was a founding father. He was in the Constitutional Convention. He had spent 8 years in jail under fascism. He was Jewish. He was socialist, and he was elected to parliament. And the story goes that he runs into a former fascist who had also been elected to the Senate. And this former fascist attempts to, because the deep right-wing discourse in Italy today is there's no difference between right and left. And so this man attempts to make friends. And Vittorio says, look, if you had won, I'd have been either in jail or in Auschwitz. We won, you're in parliament. That's the dialogue. We granted them political rights, period. And all attempts to carry it further failed because there really was no dialogue. I'm reminded of Barack Obama's attempt to negotiate with Republicans. It takes two to tango.
Thank you so much. And I have one last question. We said about different narration connected with heroism, and now we, with our colleagues, recording testimonies about different situations which we understand of heroism. Yeah, and I understanding that in future maybe this narration will connect with other aspects, yeah, or context. What do you think about maybe our difficulties or about our problems which we will have maybe in future with their level of narrations? Thank you.
I mean, all the stories that I use, were collected, were stories told 30 or 40 or 50 years afterwards. I had no experience of collecting in a time of war. So, and it may be more difficult at this time to gather critical narratives because, not because this is not what the public discourse is about, because people have to do things. So in order to do them, they had to be convinced that what they're doing is right. So it'll probably be a matter of thinking about it a few years in the future. But this is probably the main difference between doing history about war and doing history during a time of war. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.